Continue buttons. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes while people are adding. It's this double-edged sword where, you know, the conferences are kind of exhausting, but I'm at that point too where I kind of don't want it to end at the same time. I feel like, you know, that NASA countdown now, like, okay, 1 minute, T minus 60. Oh, Tracy with her kids. Gretchen, it was fun seeing your family this morning too, walking in and out.
Yes, I'm currently being stalked right now. I've got and another one in front of me too. Oh, and Andy's getting stalked too, and Tracy, yes.
Beverly always likes to be here. She's 6 years old, and she's going into first grade, and she loves being around teachers and writers, and she likes to share her writing and all sorts of things. So
that's great. Keep writing.
Okay, we are at 9:30, so I am going to call this session to order, remind everyone that it's being recorded. Introduce myself. I am Susan Giraldes. I am a professor of Spanish literature at University of the Pacific. My connection with this is that De La Peña was our student here at Pacific, and he got me connected with Steve. And I actually used some of Matt's books to teach with, and I'm starting to use more young adult fiction in the college classroom. So I'm here like madly, you know, getting to know other young adult fiction writers to use more stuff in my classes. So reminding everyone, I think you are muted. Let's see, I will ask you to write questions in the chat to make our Q&A go quickly at the end. And we're going to go ahead and start. I will have the presenters introduce themselves. So we're starting with Elizabeth, coming to us from here in California, Pepperdine. I'm in Stockton, California, by the way, Central Valley. So Elizabeth's down south with better weather and nicer beaches. So take it away, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Let me just share my screen here and get my slides up. Just one moment. Okay, I think we should be good to go. Okay, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Elizabeth Yomantas. I currently serve as an assistant professor at Pepperdine University and in the Department of Humanities and Teacher Education. So I'm a teacher educator and a former English teacher. So it's a great joy to be here with you today. Just a quick, well, before we get into it, today I'll be talking about the power of story and using anti-racist texts as social justice beginnings for undergraduate readers. And just a quick moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the university where I teach, the Chumash tribe. And so just a note to that they historically were on the land of Pepperdine, but also they still live and work in the community. And as educators, we commit to being good neighbors and supporters of our Chumash friends. Okay, so today I'm going to be sharing with you about a little mini research study I did surrounding what texts particularly stood out to students, and kind of the findings from the study are what directed the title of the study. And it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting to find, but it was exciting to find and learn about how the students really gravitated towards certain titles in the course last summer, which I am teaching again now this summer. So a little bit about the context of the course. This was for an English 380 class, a general education class called Young Adult Literature. And it was offered last June and then now again this June online during, obviously it was, early in COVID. We thought it was almost over, but it was early in COVID. And this was Pepperdine's first YA Lit class. So it was very exciting. And Dr. Bickmore was willing to Zoom with me and give me some best practices and tips, as I didn't have a YA mentor at my university. So I really appreciate that. He really helped me to shape the course. And the course started just a few days after the murder of George Floyd. And so while I had prepared the scope and sequence for the semester, it felt urgent to address some issues of police brutality head on at the beginning of the semester. So that was a challenge that I wasn't planning on. I thought we could build some rapport and read some text that could get to know each other a little better before diving into that. But it felt like that was something that I needed to do. So I moved up our police brutality text to the beginning of the semester. And obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, just lots of isolation, lots of disconnection. And so I wanted the course to have space to dream some new dreams, some ways of being together, and some ways of reconnecting with one another. And so I needed to think about, myself and in designing the class and designing the related research study. I needed to think of myself and all the dimensions of my identity as a scholar, an artist, and a teacher. And how could I bring those three together to have a really meaningful and authentic experience? And so in order to do that, how I framed the course was we looked at societal problems and possibilities. And so I think the talk that we just went to really, really connected well with that. I was like always putting up my little heart emoji because it's about opening new spaces and opening new possibilities in YA. And so we looked at, and kind of in a Freudian lens, like Paulo Freire talks about the problems that we pose, and then Henry Giroux opening up these languages of possibility. And I love that in YA, there's so many new possibilities open. So that was how we looked at it. We had this idea of golden threads. And so what's a thread? What's a theme of possibility that's opened up across different texts? And how do the authors open those possibilities? What problem are they speaking back to? And what ways are we entering the future with these new possibilities? And so my secret subtitle for the class was Inclusive Voices and Diverse Perspectives in YA Lit. The English department chair told me more students would sign up if I just called it YA Lit. So I went with that, but that was the secret subtitle there. And so in the study, I just collected some data throughout the semester, and I wanted to know which texts that we read help students to develop some new critical consciousness, some new understanding, some new socio-political consciousness about social justice issues or current events. And then what were to unpack some of those understandings. So what were some of the new things that they were knowing, growing in, and experiencing as a result of the texts. And so some of the texts here, some of the texts that we use, not all of them, we had a pretty good common trunk of texts that we used. And then we also had like a lot of choice and options throughout the semester as well. So those were some of the texts that we used. My goal was for everything to be published. The oldest book in there is Mexican White Boy from 2009, which that was fun. Actually somehow talked Matt de la Peña into coming into our class last semester as well. I don't know why he said yes, but that was really exciting. And then all the way up to, we had some 2020 publications in there as well. So we had very contemporary texts throughout the semester. And then the framework for the study that I did was in critical pedagogy, and in thinking about not just talking about things, but how can we actually build a more just world, and how can we use how can we use really good questions and a new understanding of ourselves to advance the ways that we are, the ways that we're in the world as individuals and together. And how can we take the ideas not just in theory, but think about them in practice as well. And so how we framed the course for reading the YA text was, this is a really great book. If you don't have it, it's wonderful. Teaching Culturally Sustaining and Inclusive Young Adult Literature, Critical Perspectives and Conversations by R. Joseph Rodriguez. So this is a great book. And so we used his 3 signposts, and this would be that we would keep coming back to these throughout the semester to think about, okay, how is the author achieving these things? How could the author have pushed the envelope farther? Should they have pushed it farther? Was it okay to stop there? So those would be conversations that we would have that would be ongoing. So the signposts were counter narrative inquiry as one reads, cultural literacy for an inclusive society, and self and social responsibility amongst adolescent readers. And so for the first signpost, counter narrative inquiry as one reads, thinking about making invisible stories visible for stories that are on the margins or unsanctioned by a privileged authority. The counter narrative ultimately seeks to create an anti-oppressive society with equality and equity at the forefront in spite of cultural dissonance and unequal distribution of power and access. So right there, perfect for possibilities. What new things are we seeing in the YA that we can build, that we can architect in our reality? I don't know if anyone's read Untamed by Glennon Doyle, not a YA text, just a New York Times bestseller memoir. She talks about taking ideas from 1D to 2D into 3D. And that 2D step is from idea, it's pen to paper. And so how are these authors taking ideas to pen to paper so we can architect that 3D new reality? And then signpost 2, cultural literacy for an inclusive society. So thinking about all the new questions that we're asking. How are we engaging, reading, decoding, writing, revising, reflecting the everyday life? How are we not just consuming the world, but how are we questioning the world? And how are we challenging the status quo of things? And thinking about Friday's concept of teachers as cultural workers. How are we as educators, how are we serving as cultural workers to help our students arrive at some of these new understandings? And this is a very complicated question, right? For all of the intersectional dimensions of our identity. How are we creating and facilitating these spaces where students can ask new questions and be brave in their thinking and brave in the way that they navigate in the world? And then signpost 3, thinking about self and social responsibility, thinking about how do we not just, okay, great, this is a great book, very enjoyable, let's move on. How do we take the book and then think about how are we acting in new ways, morally, socially, and politically responsible ways? And so just quickly, how I collected my data was I identify as an arts-based researcher, so kind of an extension of qualitative research, or as arts-based researchers would argue, a third paradigm. And so I collected a lot of narratives throughout the study, and then everything was on Zoom, so it was all course assignments. And thinking just about my positionality, this is like an ongoing question as a white woman educator trying to teach very progressive texts, trying to dismantle white supremacy with students, all students. How am I creating spaces that don't cause harm to our students of color? How am I creating spaces where all students can reflect on their own positionalities without causing harm to each other in doing that? So thinking about the public and the private and continuing to negotiate that. So how I got to finding out what I'll share next, I asked students as we read the semester, what was the hardest question that you had to ask yourself? And then secondly, which text made you ask that question? Think about the title of the book, and then if there's a specific part of the book that made you ask this question. And so overwhelmingly, the findings from the study, and I was quite surprised at this, were the 2 texts that had to deal with police brutality, All American Boys and The Hate U Give. If you haven't read, I'll just give you a very short overview of each. All American Boys was written in 2015 by 2 authors, one Black, one white, both men, telling the story from kind of 2 protagonists' perspectives one a victim of police brutality and one a witness of police brutality, and how they navigate for Rashad, the Black teenager, how he navigates surviving police brutality, and then for Quinn, the white protagonist, how he finds his footing as an activist. I wouldn't even call him an activist, actually, as an ally, and as someone who isn't a bystander. So, and then the hate you give, a student, a high school student basketball player witnesses police brutality and the murder of someone she loves. And so her story of reckoning with that and she doesn't overcome it, right? We can't overcome these kinds of things, but coping and dealing with that. Both of these books are on the 2020 banned book list, which I always find to be exciting when that happens. And so these two texts were the texts that overwhelmingly stood out as, for the students, new foundations of social justice and thinking about new questions. And so The Hate You Give was a choice book. So that one had less, comments. But for All American Boys, 12 of 14 students said that this was the text that made them ask a new question. And what I always find so exciting about YA is we're reading books written for children or, younger people, young teens. And here we are with undergraduate students, ages, probably to upper division, probably ages 20 to 24, asking these new questions of themselves through the text, which I just think is such a work of art when a text can speak to all people. And so there were two main findings in the study here, that the two main questions that they were asking. One was about interrogating complicity and their own implicit biases. And the second one was about navigating allyship and participating in anti-racist work. And so just a few quotes from the students so you can kind of get a vibe from some of the texts some of the new questions that they were asking from the texts. This particular text made me ask the question that was the very first text we read, All American Boys. This particular novel was moved up in our reading schedule in light of the events that had just occurred right around the beginning of the class. The specific part of the book that made me ask this question to myself was reading about Quinn's struggle with the reality of police brutality when he shared a very strong relationship with someone who was a police officer. That internal struggle that Quinn was faced with definitely was something that made me ask myself how many events and stories I was going to shrug off before I realized that I needed to make a change, to help in making a change. And so we also use Austin Channing's Trouble the Narrative. And I think the authors of All American Boys do a really good job of troubling the narrative because the characters are so rich and complex and multidimensional, and their circumstances are complicated, and they just do a really good job of troubling that narrative. Another quote, as I read this semester, the hardest question that I had to ask myself was, how am I contributing to and or passively accepting the marginalization and silencing of different communities? This was a very difficult question that I continually ask myself, especially as I read these novels while also seeing what our country is going through. The stories of all these novels has reached out to me and made me realize these stories and experiences are happening in reality. So here we see a student actually use the fiction to better connect with the actual lived experiences of what it's like currently going on in our country. Another one, the hardest question I've ever had to ask myself was how I've been complacent and or complicit in issues that require my attention, whether that is ignoring whether that is in the past or the present. A follow-up question is, how am I going to prevent myself becoming complacent or complicit in the future? The hardest question I had to ask myself was, how have I participated in the practices which pushed down the minority groups that we read about? What was my contribution to prejudice? And even harder, what have I failed to do to lift up others? And so we can see like a lot of pain here and a lot of, in a good way, of asking really good questions of like, what's our role in these situations, national, local, and anywhere in between. What's our role and what are we going to do to make a change for our future? The second one, we had a lot of students asking about how to navigate allyship, like what does that look like? How do we participate in anti-racist work? Love this quote. I noticed how much I had in common with the characters that I didn't like, the fence sitters. I understand that it is my duty to gain knowledge of those different than me and advocate for the marginalized with the power of privilege that I have. So finding, okay, we talk a lot about like how as white people, we are very responsible for dismantling white supremacy. So thinking about what does that look like in our spaces The most challenging question I had to ask myself was how I've actively participated in helping to resolve injustices which are currently being discussed in our world as exemplified in All American Boys. I had to ask myself if I was actively being a part of the solution or if I could have done more to stand up for the community around me. And so just a couple, I know I only have about 3 more minutes. So just a couple pieces, things that I've been thinking about. As I mentioned earlier, I think these texts are so powerful and underrated in the collegiate classroom for talking about race, class, gender, privilege, positionality. I think that they are obviously, we're studying YA on a really high level and thinking about theory and reading scholarly articles about the works, but at the same time, what's happening in the hearts and minds of the students is exceptional and noteworthy. And so these texts have great power, and because they're fast reads, we can get through a lot of text, which I think is really exciting. And so we did have a lot of other great things happening in the class, but for some reason, this text was, these 2 texts were of most importance, and that I think connects back really well to the signpost number 3 of seeing yourself as an agent of change and having responsibility, a social responsibility to contribute positively to the world. Also, this text just serves as a great social justice beginnings. Obviously, these are just beginnings. There's a lot of places that we could go from here, but it's just that awakening of that critical consciousness and of that of some of those ideas. And then I just think college instructors should really consider using these texts more. I've also watched student teachers teach this, in 8th grade. So all the way from, middle school up until the college level, just these texts have great conversations. A couple of questions that I want to follow up on is thinking about how have students a year later, how are the texts continuing to impact students? And if so, in what ways? I'd also love to know from other educators who are using these books about their positionalities, their pedagogical practices, their curricular designs. How are they using these texts to nurture critical consciousness? Like, what are they doing? How are they setting up learning experiences? And what are the stories of teaching All American Boys during this time of great divide and unrest in our country? And then lastly, one thing that I would extend as a result of this study was I would share more with the students about my own work as an organizer and an activist beyond the classroom, so that they could have and invite them into that work, so they could have some space to move from some of those questions into action. And that would be a way that I think would help them move from the beginnings into doing some of the actual work in organizations and grassroots organizations. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm excited to pass it over to my co-presenter.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was great. And Andy, I think you are on, and then we will go to questions at the end.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Elizabeth and Susan, and everyone for joining us here today. I was curious to see how our presentations might blend together, and I think they're going to work pretty well. One step thinking of activism, and then another step thinking about all the different types of topics that are trending in the lives of students. Certainly activism topics and topics of Black Lives Matters and all sorts of different movements. But there are topics that students are thinking about in lots of different kinds of ways. And YA texts are certainly books that can come into our lives and into student lives and help us to navigate all those different places that they see themselves in. So just in case you maybe missed the chat, I threw the URL for this presentation in the chat. There's also a QR code here, and there is a Cutly short URL down there as well. The reason why I share these is because the images throughout, there'll be notes where you can click on things and find resources for yourself as well. My name is Andy Schoenborn. I teach in Mount Pleasant, Michigan at Mount Pleasant High School. Also a past president of the Michigan Council of Teachers of English, current teacher consultant for the Chippewa River Writing Project, and also currently vice president for the Michigan Reading Association. I have been fortunate enough in the last year to have Creating Confident Writers written with my friend and colleague, Dr. Troy Hicks, published in 2020, the summer of 2020. And some of the work that you see here today is going to come directly out of that. So even though we're talking about YA Lit, And even though we're talking about reading and the topics that are trending in our lives, I think it's important for us to just take a little bit of time to consider that writing and reading, I think, are interconnected. I think you can't really have one without the other. And this is a poem written by a student of mine just about 4 weeks ago. She's a sophomore at my high school, and I have gotten her permission and parental permission to share this as well as part of a larger piece. Isabel shares why she writes. In the absence of words, I write. When I'm too hesitant to share my story aloud, I write. When I can't even bring myself to speak, for nothing I say could capture how I'm truly feeling, I write. I write for myself to try to make sense of what I'm feeling on the inside, to bring thoughts of life on a piece of paper, and to finally see it come together like it was meant to be. Freeing myself from the concealment, finishing that sentence and letting go, that feeling of release when you have given yourself what was needed. And even if you didn't, you are content with that. Because there'll always be a void to fill and a reason to write again. So my classes, we like to give snaps for those words. So if you could join me and give me some snaps for Isabel's words there. That's wonderful. I think not only why this is why she writes, I think this is why a lot of us write, but I also think this is why a lot of us read. I think it can go both ways. If we pulled out the word write throughout this poem and we inserted the word read throughout this poem, I don't think there would be much of a difference. And I mean that in a good way, because writing and reading are so interconnected that it's hard for us to imagine one without the other. So in this particular unit, it's a unit that usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks, kind of depending on the topics, depending on the students, depending on what they're choosing to read, depending on what they're choosing to write. It begins with this idea of what are the topics trending in your life. We then start with the idea of why, getting to the heart of that reason. We pull together book clubs to help us get to the heart of our why some more. We spend some time using books and maintaining a reading flow by using Beers and Probst's Book Head Heart framework, along with Tara Martin's book snaps. We read, we collaborate, we write, we learn together, and at the end of all of it, we do some authentic publishing as well. So that just gives you a little bit of a roadmap for what we're going to be experiencing here today together. So I'm going to begin by asking you this kind of a question, and I know it's kind of a vulnerable sort of a question, but I'll begin with myself, because I think it's easier a lot of times if you're your authentic, vulnerable self as a teacher to share a bit of yourself first. There's a topic in my life that is always trending, and you could categorize it, I suppose, as mental illness, although I think there's a more focused topic that trends in my life, and it's depression. I suffer from depression often. I have suffered from depression for a very long time. And if you know anything about depression, one of the things that is common amongst most people who experience depression is an utter feeling of being alone, of being the odd person out in the world, of not being able to feel connected with the things that are going on in the world. Maybe your viewpoint feels really at odds, which can add to that depression that you can feel. And I think that by acknowledging some of those types of things and sharing a little bit about the topics that are trending in your life, we can find places where we're not alone. Books can do that. Finding other people who have experiences, maybe in the classroom, can do that for you. And writing can certainly do that for me. I know depression for myself, I don't say this lightly, but poetry saved my life. And because of that, I want to give back not only to poetry, but I want to give back to students. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now, and you've probably seen this done before, and it's okay. We're going to do something called a Chatfall. Have you heard of a Chatfall before? You don't have to respond to that, but you might have heard of that. So what I'm going to ask you to try to do here, you don't have to do this, not a big deal. In the chat, do not hit enter yet, but I would just like you to write down what is a topic that is trending in your life right now. I shared mine. It was mental illness and depression. You don't have to go that deep if you don't want to. I'm not asking you to be confessional here. This is exactly what I say to my students too. I'm not asking you to be confessional. I am, however, asking you to be real. I'm asking you to be authentic. I'm asking you to share a bit of yourself, okay? So maybe you already have that topic that's kind of orbiting your mind. You have it written down there. I'll add mine too. Okay, and so I'm going to count to 3, and then we're going to hit enter, and we're going to hopefully see a large sort of fall of the different types of topics that people have in their minds right now. So 3, 2, 1, hit enter. All right, I can't just do a chat flow without kind of seeing what people might have listed here. Let's see. Reflections on how to be kinder, caring for an aging parent. Jessica writes, critical allyship, single parenting, Gretchen writes. Dog training, yep, Alzheimer's and grief, Shelley writes. I, of course, put depression, too much to do in the time I have, change, mental health, adoption, dealing with grief, ADHD diagnosis at 31, the impact of that, your grandchild being born, wonderful, life, death, all the things that go along with that, transition, pandemic, cancer, hospice, change. We have lots and lots, and Byron has all of the above. I think trying to understand, or at least giving word to the topics that are trending in our lives does something where it makes you feel like you're not alone, but it also gives some sense of all the different types of battles that people are facing all the time, every single day. And maybe some of them they're winning at the moment, and maybe some of them they feel as though they are not, and maybe some of them are new. And yes, thank you, Joe, too, for carrying all so much together. But I also think it's interesting too, not just to have us share a chat fall, but to hear what my students had written about when they talked about the topics that were trending in their life. This is what they had. They talked about mental illness. They talked about the hashtag #MeToo movement. They talked about family influences. Students talked about toxic masculinity, women's experiences, gender roles, marginalized people, college. I teach seniors and juniors, sexism. And I had one student who said, Mr. Schoenborn, there's a lot of things on here that sometimes things can feel pretty negative. And is it possible for us to talk about something positive? And I said, well, sure. What do you mean? What is it that you're interested in talking about? And she said, well, I know for myself, a lot of the books I read always talk about negative ideas when it comes to body shape and size for women. And I'd like to read something that is more about being happy with who you are, and that body shape and size doesn't matter. All that matters is who you are on the inside. And I just thought that was gorgeous. So we went with it and we put it down there. And I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to find YA books that can go with all of these. And perhaps maybe you do. Excuse me. And I think that that's great. But I don't always know all the books that might go along with these types of ideas. But what I also think is great too, is when we look at this list, I think that any of us could take one topic from each of these lists and probably have some type of a unit that goes along with it with YA books. But the challenge that I was having with that is, if I chose, let's say, to talk about the hashtag #MeToo movement and maybe rape culture and the YA books that kind of blend with that, look at all the other topics that students are interested in that kind of get pushed maybe a little bit to the side, right? So with trending topics, it's all about choice. It's all about using your authentic voice and being and honoring kind of who you are, and finding those other people nearby you who you might be able to not only find someone where you don't feel alone, but be able to find books that match those types of ideas that you're interested in as well. So the first thing that we do is we start with this idea of why. And you might have seen this before, and it's okay. It's pretty short. But Simon Sinek has something he put together about 8 years ago or so called Start With Why. We're going to watch a little bit of the video here. It's only about 3 minutes long. I won't watch the whole thing, but I share this with my students in class as well, because we'll just let Simon have to say what he's going to say, and then we can talk about that a little bit afterwards. So this is Simon Sinek's Start With Why.
A lot of people don't realize that I actually hated reading for the majority of my life. By the time I was 18, I don't think I had really read a single book unless it was part of an assignment and I was just forced to do it. But ever since I went to first grade, my teachers constantly tried to inspire me to read, and it never worked. It just made me hate it even more. And then finally, when I was about 18 or so, I started to find mentors, most of them online, and they were able to inspire me to read almost instantly. And now I can't even imagine a life where I don't read. So, what was the difference between my teachers, who tried to inspire me to read for 12 years and failed constantly, and my mentors who were able to do it in basically no time? Well, here it is in the context of the Golden Circle. My teacher started with the what. You have to read this classic. This is a great book. You have to. Then they sometimes went to the how and said, this is how you read it. But that was it. There was no why. The funny thing is, if I'd asked, why should I read it? They would probably get angry and start yelling. How could you ask a stupid question like that? What do you mean, why should you read a classic? And that anger would mostly come from the fact that they haven't really thought about the why. So they can't really clearly articulate it. Most people, and even most organizations, don't really know why they do what they do. But how are my mentors different from my teachers at school? They had successful relationships, they had success in their businesses, and they said, look, do you want your girlfriend to be attracted to you? Do you want to build a successful business? Do you want to create powerful relationships instead of always getting your emails ignored just like everyone else? And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. And they were like, okay, good, then pick up a book. Oh, and by the way, How to Win Friends and Influence People is a great book. So is The Way of the Superior Man. And I picked up both of those books and read them, and now reading is an inseparable part of my life. That is how great leaders inspire action. Everybody starts from the what, and most people never even get to the why. Most people create a product and they want to tell you about all the amazing features and specifications. They want to tell you about how these features work so well. But the truth is, most people don't care about your what and how. Most people don't want to be told the exact measurements of your CPU. They don't want to be told how the little chips interact with each other so amazingly. They want to be told something like this. We value efficiency just like you do. Here's how we can help you be more efficient. And here's a product that will help you achieve exactly that. And that's exactly what I want to buy. If you tell me my company's going to be more efficient, I want to know more. If you tell me how great your newest chip is, I don't really care. So again, most people start from the what and never even get to the why. You're not going to make that mistake. You're going to know your why, and you're going to start with it because you realize that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it.
There we are. So for this particular idea, once we know some of these trending topics, those ideas that are there, we find out who might have similar ideas. And I'll ask students to pick what are maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 different topics that are trending, so we can start to find some commonalities, right? Once we start to find those commonalities, I move students together into groups, and we can do this online. We can also do it face-to-face. I've done it hybridized as well. And then we get to talk about, so why? So, Schoenborn, you talked about depression. So what's the real why with that one? Not some sort of why that's going to make everyone feel terribly comfortable, but what's the kind of why that's the real one? What's the heart of that? And so I asked students to do something that looks like this, and I do this with them. I asked them to take a Post-it note like this, and I usually like to use red because it's like a heart. And I asked them to draw a heart in the middle of their Post-it note. And up at the top of the heart, I asked them to write down what is their kind of most important trending topic for them. And you see some of these are hard to read because students are writing in pencil, but this one over here talks about mental illness. And then I asked them to get to the heart of that why. And these are all anonymous. This is not a grade. I'm not asking students to share these out loud or anything like this. But this particular student wrote that mental illness is something I struggle with every day. Many of my friends also deal with it. I have issues recognizing my own, but instead helping other people accept me as for who I am is what they meant. So we're kind of get to that why part first, right? So once we understand that why, then we can get to a spot. Sorry. No. So then we get into groups and we talk to each other about what their topics are. So then they can, if they find similar lenses that they want to view something through, they share with the group why they chose the topic, why it mattered to them, how might that book choice be relevant to them. And then in those groups, we develop an intellectually stimulating question. I ask them to do that so that they can share at least some questions that are emerging from that particular group. From there, we take these ideas, we start to match up some books, and we find authentic book clubs. I use Goodreads, I have students use Build Your Stack, I have students use social media and PLN and a bunch of different groups like that. But we try to match books up with the different topics that they have. Then within there, students will pick the books that kind of match whatever their interests are. So now we have their why, we've matched it with their how, which is how they're going to go about reading. They're going to be reading through this particular lens, and then they're going to go into a topic where they get to the what are they going to be doing with that. So, and then once they have their books and once they have their topics, we need to do some reading. But to maintain that natural reading flow, what I'm really trying not to do is trying to make their reading just read and write another essay. I want them to read, I want them to pull information, but I don't want them to feel as though it's just another hidden kind of read a book, write an essay sort of a project. I said no, not right now. I said no, not right now. So I use from Disrupting Thinking by Kylene Beers and Robert Probst, this idea of the book, head, heart framework. And I've taken their idea and I put it together into a thinking organizer for ourselves where they keep that guiding question in mind. They talk about the heart of their why because I want them to keep that idea right there, center for them. And then they talk about a book, head, heart kind of perspective. What's the book about? What does it surprise me? What am I learning? What am I learning about it? And they're building those ideas together. That gives them also three different ways in which they can talk about the book. What the author is saying, what am I thinking about it, and how is it helping me think about myself as a learner, and as a human. We then use book snaps. So I ask students to use phones, and as they're reading, I don't want them to stop too much, but if they run into something within their reading that makes sense to them, that seems to speak to them, I ask them to take a picture of those. We just go through and take pictures, and as they go, how many pictures? I don't know, because I don't know what's going to connect with students. So as they read, they just take a picture. Once they finish their reading, they go back and then curate and annotate some of the images that made the most sense to them, and they create these book snaps. Those become helpful for them to read, collaborate, write, and learn together. Because the what are we going to be doing is we're preparing for this authentic audience. And you may be familiar with Colby Sharp and Donald Miller's Nerdy Book Club. Many, many wonderful mentor texts of real writers and real people talking about real books, real YA books. And they give about 5 or 6 different blog post types that you can write. So it gives students lots of options and how they might want to write, and then share those ideas out with the books that they've read. As we go through this, I want them to kind of be in that normal sort of publishing process. And that includes using, this is kind of like a 1-point rubric in essence. And if you click on the image, you'll see the resource itself. But we're asking, does the piece look like a mentor text? Does it include text features like the ones that you're finding interesting? So what is it that our audience, in this case, the Nerdy Book Club, which we actually submit our pieces to, what are they looking for? Does it respond to their big question in some way? Do they subtly incorporate the book head heart framework? So in other words, I don't want students just to say for my book head portion or for my head portion or my heart portion, but you weave that in. We're synthesizing this information together. They share with me, they get either check marks on yes or needs revision, they get comments, they respond back to my comments before they work on publishing their pieces. And then we ask them to send them out. And I've been fortunate enough to have a few students over the years actually get published and posted in Nerdy Book Club, which is wonderful. And these are 2 examples here. If you click on the images, you can go right to those examples and see what it is that they've accomplished with that. So you can see what students are doing as well. Pairing topics with books can be challenging. I had mentioned Build Your Stack, Nerdy Book Club top 10 lists are always really great places to kind of pair with books. But I also like just asking people on my PLN. So reaching out on social media, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook, it's hard for me to know what books might work or what books might not work because I can't read them all. but we do have wonderful people like yourselves who can be here with students and for students to give us some suggestions and ideas. Sometimes I'm fortunate enough to have grants where I can buy these books immediately, but enough times I have my library is pretty diverse and large enough that we can find books within the library of my classroom and school as well. So that takes us kind of through this roadmap of this idea of thinking about a trending topic, why that topic is important, how you're going to be thinking about that topic, and what you're going to be doing in the end. We're going to be publishing authentically as writers. So like Dr. Hicks and I say in Creating Confident Writers, we understand that language is a celebration of literacy, life, and experience when we are vulnerable enough to perceive it as such. And when we listen to our students and reach their interests, we can find not only topics that are important socially, like everybody broadly speaking, but we can move into the topics that become more individualized and topics that students are carrying with them in their hearts every single day and may not necessarily even be thinking about it too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.
And thank you
Okay.
for being patient with the chaos.
Oh, I have 2 dogs, 3 semesters of them barking through class. So it's always when we're on, right? So there were a couple of questions in the chat, I think for Elizabeth. So we'll start there and then just kind of roll. The first one I think was pretty simple, which was you had said the name of your secret course title, and if you could repeat that.
Sure, yeah. So the official title was Young Adult Literature. Secret title, Diverse Voices and Inclusive Perspectives in Contemporary Young Adult Literature.
Elizabeth, could you do us a favor and write that in the chat? That, because it is a long one, so people would have it.
Yes.
And then the second one, and actually I think this one might be good for both of you. It came up when Elizabeth was presenting, but I mean, it certainly is a topic. And that was, what are your thoughts on the current uproar over critical race theory?
Yeah, so that's exciting.
That's a word for it.
I have been thinking about, it's such an odd conversation, I feel like, because, you see these like memes and it's like, oh, if your child in 4th grade is learning critical race theory, like congratulations, they're actually in law school or something like that. So I think for me anyway, working with the students and the undergraduate students and talking about critical race theory and thinking about it like a lens, right? Like it's not an object, but it's a lens for how we can view, some very important topics in racism and thinking about, analyzing that lens, right? So providing the framework and then, discussing the different arguments and things surrounding that and different viewpoints. And I think like all things in teaching, we never tell the students like what to believe or how to think, but provide them, with the context and the current events that are going on. And I always share with students like my perspective on things because I think that's a requirement as aspiring to be a anti-racist educator. So I'll always share my perspective and where I land on the issues. So that's just what I do, but that's in the undergraduate framework. So I don't know if Andy maybe wants to talk about in the K-12 space.
I can talk about it just a little bit. I know in my school district, it's becoming something that there seems to be a squeaky wheel that's not a huge number of people, but one that is very loud when it comes to critical race theory, kind of opposing it. There are also people who then kind of oppose the opposers, so to speak. But I think bringing it into the classroom, especially using it as a way to listen to what students are thinking about, like Elizabeth talked about, and having them kind of come to some of their own ideas, and that I think is a really good idea. The other thing is too, when I think about critical race theory, it's really easy to think about just me and my family, but me and my family and my extended family and my students and all the people that I care about are not just from one perspective. They're not just from one race. They're not even, I mean, I have multiracial nieces and nephews, and I have just so many different kinds of people. So when I think about critical race theory, I think it's very myopic to think about it as just from a one white person's perspective, when we are all, I mean, aren't we supposed to be more blended in this America? That's kind of what this is about. So I think that it can be, I think how you approach it can be two different ways, right? I think if you approach it from a lens of learning and understanding and looking at it as a theory, not as something that, you know, you better do this or else, for example, I think is helpful, because otherwise there can be a lot of, you know, these ideas where parents feel as though the public school systems are trying to indoctrinate their children in ways that they don't want to be indoctrinated. So those are just kind of my thoughts on it. I will just say, I am no critical race theory expert, right? So I'm still trying to figure it all out as we go, but I do know that I want my students, my family, my children to be able to see themselves in books, however they choose to see themselves. And I think that has a connection to critical race theory, because the more we see ourselves as being like what Carrie Ann Holt talked about, more we see ourselves in these places and spaces, the more we feel less othered and more accepted in this world that we find ourselves in. So that's what I would say, considering critical race theory.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute left. If somebody has a short question for someone, short question, short answer. Or are we ready to wrap it up? That was great, and I think the two presentations did. It was really nice having the college and the high school together.
So I can respond to, it looks like Willie J29 really quick. How can I bring in more student choice while teaching content mandated by a curriculum? Many people, even though you have a mandated curriculum, which I understand, I do too, but we also have wiggle room. Part of that wiggle room happens in independent reading or sustained silent reading. And you could make this more like a topic that students are choosing and present and creating a proposal for that specific topic. And so they can do that within that. So yes, they're choosing their own books, they're finding their own ideas, they're doing it, instead of doing like a book report, they're doing it in a way that is still meeting their needs as far as those own kinds of ideas and books. And what if there's only one student who has a particular trending topic? That's great. That's wonderful. I think stick with that. That doesn't mean they still can't collaborate with others. They just get to share their ideas and share their whys a little bit more too. So that's just kind of a quick response to those two questions.
Okay, and we are at time. So Amy is going to shut us down. That was a great session. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Elizabeth, and everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Amy, it's better to make sure you end it and then start a new one. They're easier to download when we get to that point. So thanks.
All right,
Thank
I'm going to
you.
end the meeting now. If you're here for the next session, this will be back up in just a moment.